Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Maybe you could answer a question. If the debt was increased by $8 billion more, how does that affect the long-term ability of the government, or what does that cost in interest and debt servicing to the nation?
Thanks for the question. I don't think we can answer that at this time, and we're not best placed to answer sort of the effects of additional spending on debt, on federal debt.
I could figure it out with my pencil here if I had to. So you can't answer what $8 billion more in debt is going to cost the taxpayer to service the debt? Someone must be able to answer that. Nope. Anyway, we were elected on April 28th, and Canadians expect us to carry out the platform that we presented to everybody. For those reasons, I'm opposed to this amendment. We balanced everything out in our election platform so that we could be fiscally responsible. You look at the programs that we've delivered through C4 with the GST tax credit, the removal of the consumer carbon pricing, as well as the tax cut here that we're talking about that's benefiting 22 million Canadians. All these decisions we make about taxation and spending, we must remember that they're fiscal choices and they were part of the total platform. So to cherry pick a deeper tax cut that the Conservatives had in their platform and build it into ours, but don't offset it with savings. And if we were to put this in, then what are the savings? Are we going to cut health transfers to the provinces? Are we going to reduce the help that we're investing in Build Canada Homes so that we can address the housing shortage? I don't know. Maybe we're going to stop any funding for climate transition and adaptation. Everything comes with a cost. We think we've done it fiscally responsible. So we see that, and I guess in conclusion, finally, if we don't give ourselves a little wiggle room, if we give a larger tax break, then we're going to be in a position where if we have a crisis like we're dealing with now with our southern neighbor, where we have to have responsive programs for tariffs, unjustified tariffs, we don't have the ability to do that. So for those reasons, I can't support this amendment. I think Canadians know that by investing in infrastructure and projects, whether they be small or large across Canada, with port renovations to improve our ability to export, with an energy corridor to improve our ability to have electricity infrastructure in all regions of the country, are all things that Canadians supported the Liberal Party for in the election. And so for those reasons, I can't support this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McDonald. I have Mr. Turnbull next on the list. Mr. Turnbull? Yeah, so if not, I can go to the next person on the list, Mr. Kelly. Sure, that is Mr. Sawatsky. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to add on to what you were saying, the cuts would need to come from somewhere, and who are we going to tell it's not getting the funding? You mentioned, are we going to have to cut climate programs? Well, we can't afford to cut our climate programs. I mean, we have a moral responsibility to reduce our greenhouse emissions and make sure that we're sustainable in the long run. And so, that is an option. I don't see that as a very good idea personally. As you mentioned, a lot of what we're doing here is investing into large-scale projects that will grow the economy, grow the GDP, as you mentioned, such as ports, electrical corridors, and all of those sorts of things. And so there is a big difference between investing in these long-term projects that will grow the economy versus just irresponsibly cutting taxes with like really just in an irresponsible fashion. So I guess all that to say, I don't agree with this either. I think this is not well thought through. And just talking about the income tax rates compared to our G7 and OECD peers, I'm wondering if any of the witnesses here would be able to elaborate on how Canada compares to our G7 peers.
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member for his question. I think I can answer that generally. There are different ways to measure personal income tax rates, and I don't have any of the figures in front of me. One commonly recognized measure that I would point to is carried out by the OECD. So it's, all the countries in the OECD, and it's basically measuring taxes on workers in a comprehensive way. And if you look at those comparisons, and it can be, say, a single person with, an average wage, a family where where one spouse is making, say, higher than the average wage and the other is making, lower than the average wage. Can relative to G7 and relative to OECD countries, Canada is, doing is on the lower end of those tax rates in terms of, paying less tax, and in this and reducing the lowest marginal personal income tax rate by 1 percentage point will, bring that down even a bit more. So, it's potentially something we can follow up on, but I think I can make that general statement for now.
Well, that is pretty promising, and so that I think is good news. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sawatsky. I'll now go to Mr. Littau.
Très bien, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. There is one point that I'd like to mention. I agree with you. When we compare Canada to our OECD partners, with this proposed tax cut, it would bring us to comparable and better positioned than our partners. But to go back to the budget, what's important to remember, we're talking in a difference of almost $9 billion a year between our proposal established in C4 and that of the proposal presented by the Conservatives. We're talking about $9 billion every year, forever, or almost. So this is a recurring effect. And this could undermine our leeway, our fiscal leeway going forward. And this would also mean that, as my colleagues have already mentioned, we'd already have to cut our expenses or transfers to individual Canadians with respect to OIS, the CCB, etc., all of these social programs that are close to our heart. So, and they are very significant, and I think Canadians in general appreciate these type of social programs as well. They make Canada what it is and different from our U.S. neighbor. Our proposals from the Conservatives would be a step in the other direction. And Canadians would have to expect much lower support from their government. They'd have to just get by on their own. If they work hard, they would have their more money in their pockets, and that's all they would have. That's it. And that is not the approach that we've developed in Canada in our society. We like to show solidarity and mutual assistance, and is very different from the individualism that is somewhat hidden, in my opinion, behind this much more significant tax cut. And inevitably, it would have to be offset by cuts in spending that would be much more draconian. My colleagues often mentioned that the deficit is terrible, so I would assume that they would be cutting spending in a very drastic way. And the only way to do so would be to slash social programs and transfers to individuals and provinces. I don't think this is what Canadians want. So we could just let debt pile up, but I don't think this would really make sense, because for months the Conservatives have been hammering the point that spending's already out of control, although it's not really. So if we moved forward with a stronger tax cut without offsetting spending, that's what we'd be looking at. What could this lead to? Well, in the UK, not too long ago, they had a Conservative government as well, a new Conservative government that decided to also massively slash taxes, Ms. Truss, and we saw later what has been classified as a mistrust moment, because it led to a total rebellion of the financial markets, and the UK finance minister said, no, you can't do that. If you do that, the markets will no longer trust us to repay the British debt. So then we'll have a true crisis on our hands. And it led to the end of that government. It didn't last very long. So do my conservative colleagues, are they trying to lead us to such a mistrust moment? This would be rather spectacular, ladies and gentlemen, for a party that claimed to be one of fiscal responsibility. They would be eliminating the leeway that we have, and we have to also leave room for the future, a future that is somewhat concerning, given the fact that our U.S. neighbor is not very reliable right now. So we have to be ready as a government to support the economy, to support companies who fall victim to this trade war with our U.S. counterparts. So we have to hold up the Canadian economy and support it until this trade war can be resolved to our advantage. We can't just sign anything. Otherwise, we'd be in a much more trickier position than the one we find ourselves in now. So like the Prime Minister has said very well during question period today, he has said we'll be massively investing in our economy. And we believe in the ability of our government to invest to do so, and we have to have access to financial markets, and to do so we also need a credible budget in our eyes. We are going to be able to judge this on November 4th. You will see that we do have a credible budget, but if we accepted this amendment, our budget would no longer be credible. It would be dangerously falling into a mistrust moment if we do what our Conservative colleagues are asking us to do. We don't want to do that. We still have our AAA credit rating and the debt to GDP ratio that is manageable. So we do want to keep this. So for the time being, Madam Chair, I think I'll stop there. My colleagues want to move on to other things or have any other points to add. Thank you very much, Mr. Lautow. Mr. Turnbull?
I keep coming back to the fact that this is so inconsistent with what Conservatives have been saying in the House of Commons every single day ad nauseum. We hear them say that the government should be spending less, and they're essentially proposing to increase, to forego tax revenue. At a scale that would significantly and negatively impact the government's ability to spend in other areas. I think what we're proposing is a very balanced approach. I think Canadians knew what they were voting for in our platform. Again, I think the Conservatives may have forgotten that they did not form government. They actually lost the last election, which they maybe have forgotten, but we'll remind them every day as we govern. But I think, for me, it's so hard to understand how they square this with the things that they say on a daily basis in the House of Commons, which is really inconsistent with what we see here in this House. Like, I think I will be using this as an example in the House of Commons in every speech that I give and every response in question period that I have the opportunity to deliver in the future, that while the Conservatives are saying that we need to decrease government spending, that we need to essentially be more fiscally responsible, they're at the same time in committee asking us to spend or forego billions, tens of billions of dollars worth of revenue that can be invested into the economy. I think our government, in its new capital budgeting framework, and our new budget cycle, is taking a really responsible approach to saying, okay, we're going to bring down government operating expenses. We're going to increase a focus on capital formation in the economy. And to me, we have the fiscal space to do that within the AAA credit rating that we enjoy in this country. We had recent comments from the head of the International Monetary Fund over I believe it was just last weekend. I think the minister read that out in question period recently. And these statements basically indicate that the IMF agrees with both the changes to the capital budgeting framework and to the budget cycle, but also has said that our approach, which is to diversify trade, invest in infrastructure, invest in special projects, housing, infrastructure, energy, etc., that will help boost productivity. And that's essentially, I think the counterbalance to this is to say, well, yeah, we're reasonably offering a tax cut to Canadians, which they voted for in the last election, and simultaneously we're balancing that, because we understand that there is a fiscal hit to that foregone revenue. And I think that when we stimulate the economy and focus on capital formation, we'll have additional revenues that come in that counterbalance those tax measures. So that's why it's a balanced approach. And we know right now that if we don't pivot and we don't adapt to the changing environment that the world is in due to our biggest, traditionally what has been historically our most trusted trade partner, that we run the risk of a declining GDP, that we run the risk of lack of opportunities for our workers and Canadian citizens, and we will see a diminished economy. What we're interested in doing is growing the economy, and I think we're balancing that with a tax cut. So what I find so strange is that the Conservatives, on the one hand, say that they want essentially us to decrease spending, and on the other hand, they're proposing essentially to take a fiscal hit that would be in the tens of billions of dollars to the fiscal framework. Like I really think that this would compromise the stability of Canada's economy, and it would compromise our ability to invest in a growing economy, because we would have less fiscal room within our balanced approach to actually work with. And that concerns me. I find it very surprising. I won't say despicable, even though I know that's a word that's been used recently in the House of Commons. Well, actually, it was outside of the House of Commons by the Leader of the Opposition when referring to our RCMP, which is really a shame that he would say such a thing. But I will just say that, I just find it hard to believe that the Conservatives are the ones proposing this, even though I get that it was in their platform. So I kind of understand that we shouldn't be that shocked, perhaps, because it was in their platform. But you unfortunately lost the election. I'm sure you can, at this point, acknowledge that, given that you're still sitting in the opposition benches after 10 years. I would just say, and I'm not meaning to rub that in any way. I just think that, it's important for us to recognize who is actually in the driver's seat governing the country, which is us. And unfortunately for you, Canadians sided with our tax measures and our balanced approach. And so that's what we're implementing. And I go back to, the Ways and Means motion that we passed in the House of Commons that was extremely clear in terms of the summary and the recommendation about the tax cut that we voted on. So I think this is a fundamental change to what we were elected to deliver on. I think it exceeds the scope. I know that I asked the question already, and it's been determined that this was actually in scope. But because of the fiscal hit that this would have and the fact that it exceeds the scope, I really can't understand how we can support this. We certainly can't. I know my other colleagues have asked questions and spoken to this, and I agree with their sentiments entirely. But it's really it's strange to see this coming from the Conservatives. And I think, I don't know what they would cut. Like if they were governing this country and they offered this tax break, they would cut indiscriminately like they've done in the past, which we saw under Stephen Harper. We saw under other Conservative governments where there was this, cut to Veterans Affairs offices, cuts to defense spending, cuts to everything. It just seemed like it was a really significant, deep effort to cut, which does remind us of Liz Truss. I think my colleague mentioned Liz Truss. Nothing against her personally, but certainly did the UK economy ever tank shortly after she got into power. And I think she was the shortest serving, if I'm not mistaken, Prime Minister in the UK's history. And I think the Conservatives are adopting pages from her approach, which seemed to me to be, going to compromise the stability of our economy and hinder the government's ability to make other investments. So those are my concerns with this particular amendment. So I thought I'd get some more of those on the record, and I'm sure my other colleagues will have some more thoughts to contribute to the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Littell? Oh, sorry, no, Mr. Sawatsky. Sorry, somebody on the list.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know there's a lot of details here, and I just want to stress the importance that we actually do go through all of the important context when we're making decisions that are going to impact all Canadians. Sometimes it takes a while to get through all the details. However, it is really important that we do flesh everything out here because there's a lot of context that needs to be gone over. So, you know, of course, a lot of us are waiting for this budget that's coming out on November 4th. And something important to note here is that this is a budget that has a new capital investment budgeting framework. And that framework is going to distinguish between current operating expenditures and capital investments. So this is a really important thing to pick apart here. So that's going to help the government prioritize investments that are going to deliver those long-term benefits for Canada. So the operating expenditures are going to be balanced by 2028, 2029, and the 2025 budget is certainly going to rise to the occasion here. It's going to be a budget. We're going to build the strongest economy here in the G7, and it's going to do something that's very concrete to make life more affordable. So, you know, of course, we know that the cost of living is still a constant priority for Canadians. I certainly heard a lot of that throughout my campaign. In fact, most people I talked to were that was kind of the first thing that came to mind is, you know, what are you most concerned about? And most people were really just wanting to bring those prices down, you know, whether that's for their groceries, their rent, and so on. So, you know, we know here, you know, with the government that is really one of the biggest challenges to Canadians. And, you know, of course, part of affordability there is the cost of housing. You know, of course, we're facing a housing crisis, particularly for younger generations that are being born into a housing market in which they just cannot afford to even think about the concept of buying. And so that's something that is really important for us to address as the government. And so, you know, part of that is we're implementing an approach to increase the supply of housing for Canada. For example, the Prime Minister recently launched a new federal agency that's responsible for building affordable housing on a large scale called Build Canada Homes. And that's going to combat homelessness by building supervised and transitional housing in collaboration with provinces, territories, and municipalities and Indigenous communities. So this is a really big step towards making housing more accessible for a lot of Canadians. And so, you know, Bill C4, we're talking about affordability, and this is just, you know, one example of making things more affordable for Canadians. And so it's going to build community-based, highly affordable housing for low-income households, and that's also going to partner with private developers to build affordable housing for the country's middle class, which is oftentimes some of the folks who are struggling most. So to do that, to help Canadians buy those homes, the proposed elimination of GST for first-time home buyers is for homes valued at $1 million or less, and also reducing the GST for first-time home buyers of new homes valued between $1 million and $1.5. And so, you know, as Canadians demanded, we kind of putting money back in their pockets by cutting taxes. However, you know, bringing it back to the topic at hand here, this is cutting taxes in a responsible way, and cutting taxes in a way that will help Canadians most and is not going to have lots of other unfortunate impacts, which the Conservative Party is proposing of cutting taxes. You know, we want to be fiscally responsible here and consider the best interests of Canadians, not only today, but going forward well into the future. And also, you know, with the investment into the long term in mind here. So since July 1st, all Canadians have benefited from a tax cut that will save a dual income family of up to $840 per year starting in 2026. And, you know, that may sound small to some, but for those who are living paycheck to paycheck and really struggling, then, you know, $840 can mean being able to put food on the table. And so, that is something really important coming to all Canadians. 22 million Canadians, in fact. That's a lot of people who will benefit and benefit while keeping things fiscally responsible here on the government. So they can now keep more of their paycheck and use that according to their priorities. Of course, like with the trade tensions with the United States, we know that the importance of continuing to support Canadians affected by this dispute. Like, since the beginning of this, we've put a robust Canadian system of economic support to help businesses and workers directly affected by the U.S. tariffs. We have heard so consistently of all of the industries that are really, really struggling right now. The auto industry, the steel industry, aluminum, softwood lumber, which is particularly being hit hard in my home province of BC. These are all things where these industries sometimes need supports from the government, and the government needs to have some extra funding to be able to deliver these industries. Otherwise, we have companies that are shutting down, moving to the United States. This is a really big problem, and the government needs to be fiscally able to support these companies. When things are looking like they're about to go under, that's when the government needs to step in and assist. And fortunately, the government has been able to assist here. So, we're coming back to the concept of unfunded tax cuts, really, which is what this measure is proposing. The Conservative Party claimed that this was responsible spending, but frankly, it's not. To the witnesses, I'm wondering perhaps if you might be able to speak of perhaps any other cases of countries that pass large unfunded tax cuts, especially when the full implications aren't able to be weighed out. Could you maybe provide any examples of when this has happened in the past and what the outcome of that might have been?
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member for his question. It's an interesting one. I think we're best placed as officials to respond to technical questions on the bill before you.
Okay, perhaps a different question. I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate on the different kinds of analyses that officials do to calculate the impacts of a large tax cut, including potential unexpected impacts on government revenue.
Thanks for the question. So typically speaking, when we analyze a proposal of, for example, like a rate reduction, we look at several things based on certain principles. We look at the potential effectiveness. We look at the efficiency of a proposal. We look at the equity implications of that. So which groups of people, income, age, and gender will be affected and how. We look at whether or not that a potential proposal would have implications in terms of like the simplicity or versus complexity on the tax system, and we try to also consider any implications for administering a potential change.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, with that in mind, are you able to bring this to the amendments we're speaking of and perhaps add any kind of analysis of this amendment, or would that be not suited right now?
Thanks for the follow-up. I think most of what we can provide has already been said. Essentially, that the amendment would further reduce the first rate, which would also further reduce the non-refundable tax credit rate, since the two are linked, and we talked about that. We talked about the difference in the fiscal impact. So I think that's probably about the extent of what we can give at this time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sawatsky. I now have Mr. Letow.
Merci, Madame Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to continue in the same vein because I think it's particularly important. when the officials who work in this area, well, when the government is preparing a budget, for example, and they propose fiscal measures, it takes some time to analyze the repercussions of these proposed measures by the minister. There are all sorts of things that could happen and various results. And throughout your career, have you seen a Canadian government of any stripe establish a major tax change that is based on 30 minutes of analysis via an amendment? I think it would take a little more than 30 minutes to study this. And this is not the way you work, if I'm not mistaken.
Madame la Présidente, j'aimerais remercier.
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member for his question. Well, what can I say? In general, we provide our advice to the government, to the minister. We're truly part of the team at the Department of Finance. There's several of us. We have our role to play by working in generally on the budget framework and sometimes on the economic statement. That's our normal frame of work. But it's not easy for me as an official to comment on the analyses conducted by other groups. We know what our work is, and I think we know it rather well. But it's important to, well, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Très bien, merci.
Very well, thank you. I understand very well. But in general, you always do very comprehensive work. And I don't think it's reasonable to think that we could just implement such a major change like this, which would deprive the state of roughly $9 billion a year, in addition to what's already been set out in our budget. That was carefully studied by the finance team. It would be unreasonable to implement such a measure of such a scope at a parliamentary committee and then just discuss this for a few minutes. I don't think that's how we need to proceed. That's not how a structured and serious government would proceed. Therefore, that's not reasonable to do things this way. Now, if I'd like to, could go back to the importance of having a credible budget. It's always important, of course, but it's particularly important in the current setting because, as we've said, and the Prime Minister said once again this morning, this afternoon during question period, he said this once again because this is not the first time we're going to be investing massively in our economy. But why are we going to do this? We are going to do this mainly because, well, for two reasons. First, we are facing historic tough time for the future of our country. We are facing a partner that used to be deemed reliable and for whom we've had long-standing trade deals with and a very intertwined economy. And now suddenly we find ourselves in this whirlwind, a very complex one, where our partner is changing the rules arbitrarily And our government has to be able to support companies and our economy to get through this this period of uncertainty, because it's this uncertainty that hampers economic growth. Even companies that aren't directly affected by the trade war are hesitant to invest. They need to make decisions, business decisions, without knowing what the future holds. Suddenly, the rules change, sometimes 3 times in the same week, and it creates a great deal of uncertainty, which is very harmful for the private sector. So the government has to have the means to support these companies, and the objective of what our investment is, the additional investment is, as indicated, will be indicated in our budget on November 4th, is above all, not exclusively, but primarily to strengthen what our economy is offering. We have to be able to increase our capacity to produce, our supply, and to grow our country. If these were just measures that would just affect demand without affecting our production capacity, well, there could be sizable inflationary measures, but that's not what we're proposing to do. What we're proposing to do is to increase our production capacity and supply so we can provide other goods and services, so we can significantly enhance our capacity for national defense, to truly build a defense sector. We didn't worry about this over the past decade, so really we have to take care of this now. So we have to boost our production capacity, and to do so, the government has to play a leading role. It's not the government that's going to start building factories and all sorts of things, but we need to facilitate such operations wherever possible. And in some sectors, we need to provide the necessary trust and to invest in this new economy that we want to create, the new Canadian economy. It needs to be more resilient and less dependent on our U.S. partner, because we found ourselves in a situation where a vast majority of our exports go to only one market, namely the U.S. market, one we know very well. We can't change our geography. Our neighbor will still be our neighbor to the south. But in the longer term, we clearly have to diversify our trade, our markets, penetrate other markets, develop other ties, economic ties, and trade ties with other partners. And to do so, we need to invest massively in our infrastructure and capacity. And this is primarily what our budget on November 4th will set out. That will be our roadmap. And you will see this in our budget on November 4th. At the same time, we have to be able to support the sectors that are being directly affected right now by the arbitrary tariffs that have been imposed: steel, aluminum sectors, softwood lumber, and even copper to some extent. And who would have thought that Canadian cupboard makers would have been seen as a threat to our partners? Well, that's kind of the background we're finding ourselves in right now. So the Canadian government has to be able to facilitate this investment and have the necessary leeway to make this investment. And this means we have to be responsible. We've already said that our operational expenses will be very rigorous. This will give us the necessary leeway to invest massively in our new economy. The new economy as well that has to factor in climate change. And even if we don't talk about climate change as much, recently we talked about food inflation, for example. Cost of groceries, they're going up. Every month, every year, it's terrible. And I don't want to minimize this. It is very concerning, food inflation. But let's look at why this is happening. Is it a Canadian phenomenon? Is only food in Canada that costs more? No. It is clearly a global phenomenon, one that affects a lot of our allies, whether they're in Europe, Asia, and U.S. as well. We've seen the cost of food go up, continue to rise, and everywhere. So why? Why is this happening? Our conservative friends talk about liberal taxes. Well, we don't have tax on food. That can't be the factor behind the rising food costs in Germany or in France. But why? Why are we seeing this global trend? Well, Madam Chair, I need to go back to climate change. What we have seen in the past few years is a succession of climate events. Forest fires, droughts, floods, crop failures, lost harvests. My conservative friends have often talked about recently the rising costs of coffee and sugar. Well, we don't produce these goods here. They're imported. I don't think there's coffee produced in Saskatchewan. So these are global prices of raw materials that are affected by climate change. And that, Madam Chair, is, well, these changes are already here. It's too late. The impacts of these changes are already being felt, whether you believe in climate change or not. There is a very real and concrete impact, and it's not going to decrease. So the role of the government, of public policy now, is to figure out how to adapt to such climate change. Global temperatures, well, we're trying to limit it to 2 degrees Celsius, the increase. I think that's the target. This is a planetary we've already seen much more change than that in Canada, for example. We're already looking at 3 or 4 degrees. So it's already having a very concrete impact in terms of floods and droughts, forest fires, etc. So how can we adapt to this? We need to build an economy that will be resilient with respect to the climate and that will be able to resist such change. So I think food prices will continue to be impacted by climate change, which won't be able to go back. So how do we adapt our agriculture as well and our ability to produce food and distribute it? All of these are very important and concerning issues, And we believe on this side of the House that the government has a role to play, an important one, and even a determinant one. Ideologically, I think my conservative friends have a very different opinion than this. They think the government should be minimalistic with the less amount of intervention possible, and they should remove themselves from such interventions and just let the market regulate itself and decide for itself without state intervention. But we think, on the contrary, that in this environment of climate uncertainty and the need to adapt to change that is already at our door and aggravated by the trade war with our key trade partner and aggravated by deterioration in our geopolitical situation, what's happening in other countries. For example, the Great North in Canada. And Madam Chair, you were there this week, I think yesterday or the day before. The German Minister of Defense was here and came to the Canadian Parliament to talk with members of the Commission and the Industry and Defense Commission. They explained the need to deal with this new tension, geopolitical tension. And the German minister was accompanied by the Norwegian defense minister, because these two countries, Germany and Norway, work hand in hand. Not only they're both members of NATO, but they're also have strengthened their cooperation militarily and strategically. And I remember one of the statements that the Norwegian minister said. He said, when we look at the planet from above, or Norway from above, it looks very different than if we look at it from London, Paris, or New York. In the north, Russia is just there, just next door, for example. So we need to be aware of these new challenges, geopolitical challenges, and we have to be aware of this new reality, climate reality. I think the climate deniers that are out there, they should start understanding this, that every day we're dealing with the effects of climate change already. It's already irreversible. So for all of these reasons, we think that the government, the Canadian government, must have the necessary leeway to be able to intervene, to be able to deal with this change. And if we had accepted the amendment proposed by my Conservative colleagues, it would diminish significantly our ability to intervene, and it would force us to do things that would be counterproductive, particularly in a time of great uncertainty, and we see the global economy is slowing down. So this is not the time for a contraction in overall spending. It's not the right time when we're facing uncertainty and an economic slowdown that is global. Someone has to step up, and that's the government. Our governments don't think this. That's their right, but we do. And this issue has been somewhat decided. Well, it was decided last April. And perhaps we'll have to see the way things lie once again soon, but this is our position for now. And if we want to have the means for our ambitions, we cannot deprive ourselves of $9 billion or $8 billion in fiscal in revenue every year in our calculations. We'd have to do a constant dollar calculation for 2025, but over time, it would be more than $9 billion a year. So, Madam Chair, I will stop there, and I will continue later after my colleagues speak. Thank you very much.
Thank
little
you.
change.
Yeah, and Mr. Letao, he's new to Parliament, so I congratulate him on his skill as a filibusterer. And we have witnessed something I've never seen before. We are about 102 minutes into this meeting wherein Liberal government members are filibustering their own bill. I don't think I've ever seen that before, where the government is trying to prevent its own clauses in its own bill from coming to a vote. We're on clause 2. We're 100 minutes into this meeting and we're on clause 2. I've never seen that before. And it's disappointing because this is actually a bill that does contain some important measures that we had, as an opposition party, had agreed with and had voted and allowed it to come to this committee where it could be studied, which it has been studied, and we came prepared today to engage in a clause-by-clause review with an aim to move this bill along. So if this amendment is an amendment that the Liberals can't even handle allowing to come to a vote, there are a number of other amendments ahead of us today, and I don't want to see the business of this committee derailed because we are waiting to start an important study on money laundering. So as a path forward, if these Liberals are going to spend all day filibustering an amendment to lower taxes further for Canadians and in order to make life more affordable for Canadians, I am prepared to, and I would need the unanimous consent of this committee to do so, to withdraw this amendment so that we can move on to the next amendment. So, Chair, I through you would put it to the committee. If that will help us make some progress and allow this committee's scheduled business to continue and get us eventually to our study that we need to begin, I will ask to withdraw this amendment. They don't want the amendment, so I presume that they will allow it to be withdrawn. So I will ask for the unanimous consent of this committee to withdraw this amendment.
Unanimous consent is required for this? Do we
Yes.
have unanimous consent to withdraw the motion?
We suspend for a moment.
We can suspend.
Thanks.
We will suspend for a moment. So, suspend. we have unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment? We do. Okay, all right. So amendment, do you,
Yeah,
Withdraw.
with the amendment withdrawn, I have no further, I mean, we're no longer debating that. We would, I trust we will immediately move to the next amendment.
okay. So shall clause 2 carry?
Whoa. No.
Yeah,
the-
we're at clause 2, Mr. Kelly. Sorry?
But the,
There are no more amendments on that clause.
okay, sorry,
Yeah, so the unamended clause 2,
on division.
shall it, on division?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I do,
Okay, so now we have,
sorry, while I,
Mr. Kelly?
while I think I still do have floor if I've not let go,
Well, no, I just moved, no, you
okay.
let go.
We're going to go, all right, so
Yeah.
we're going to the NDP
Yeah,
number
so you
2.
can turn your mic off, yeah. Okay, now we are going to new clause 2.1, NDP 2. It's deemed moved. Mr. Davies is not here. Ms. Kwan, would you like to speak briefly to it?
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Hallelujah. On progress being made with the bill. On the NDP Amendment 2, essentially what this does is that would require the Minister of Finance report to Parliament and the public on how reducing the lowest federal personal income tax rate affects the value of non-refundable tax credits, which are calculated using that same tax rate. This is critical. This is a critical measure because lowering the personal income tax rate not only reduces the amount of tax owed, but also diminishes the value of tax credits, such as the disability tax credit, the age credit, and the caregiver credit. These are important supports, particularly for lower income Canadians, seniors, and people with disabilities. For individuals who claim these tax credits, the net benefit of the government's proposed tax cut will be significantly reduced. The National Disability Network, March of Dimes Canada, and Inclusion Canada have also raised these concerns that some claimants may be worse off overall, as the drop in credit value could outweigh the savings from the lower tax rate. Recent testimony before this committee from the Finance Minister, Francois Philippe Champagne, and Senior Finance Official Stefania Bartusi confirms that the government is aware of the unintended consequences of the reduction in the lowest personal income tax rate on non-refundable tax credits. And on October 6, 2025, Finance Minister Francois Philippe Champagne told this committee that, and I quote, "We heard concerns regarding unintended consequences of the tax rate on some disability tax credit recipients. I can assure you, Madam Chair, that we're working on resolving them," end quote. By mandating a transparent, timely report to Parliament and the public, this amendment ensures that the full impact of the tax change is understood and that vulnerable groups are not unintentionally disadvantaged. This amendment also holds the minister accountable to his commitment to address these impacts, ensures that Parliament can monitor progress on mitigating harm to vulnerable Canadians. Madam Chair, I hope that committee members will support this amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. J'ai déjà M. Garand sur la liste, alors allez-y.
Mr. Garand, you're on the list, so please go ahead. Thank you, Madam Chair. I will try to speak as long as Mr. Letao, but I think even with the experience I have, I don't think I will be able to do that type of work, which I admire greatly. We are in favor of this amendment. We were the first to share our concerns with the committee with respect to the lower amounts of the tax credit for people with disabilities, and I think there should be a consensus. Well, we discussed the amendment earlier amendment for almost an hour and a half. They asked officials questions in terms of the list of tax credits that would be affected by the CPC 1 amendment, which was removed in the end. But it's a question of transparency, and I agree with my colleague, NDP colleague. The minister said that he would find solutions, and we need to cost all of this, and the Liberals will be happy. Mr. Tao said earlier that spending was out of control, but this measure doesn't cost anything. He'll be happy to know that. So I expect he would be in favor of it as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Garon.
Yeah, so thanks for this. Appreciate Ms. Kwan motivating this this amendment and speaking to it. I think it's certainly an interesting one, and I know that it was deemed admissible, so that's good. We can have a little bit of debate and talk about this, but I have a few questions for the officials. So one is, are these types of reporting mechanisms common for legislation that has fiscal impacts? So that's my first question. So is there analysis typically done when government legislation has a fiscal impact?
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member for his question. I think my response would be that it's not common, but I think there are some instances where it has been done. Thinking of recent years. So.
So do you have any examples in mind of where it has, where there's been a sort of pre-study or a study that's been done on the analysis of even the interaction? Because I think in this case, what Ms. Kwan is pointing to is what we've heard from some stakeholders is that there's interactions between some of the non-refundable tax credits and the income tax cut. And I'm just wondering whether there's an analysis done internally on a fairly regular basis when there's such interplay or, when there's going to be an impact on people, and how do you assess that?
Madam Chair, I think what I would tell the member is that when we study any tax change like this one, we're using the data on tax filers at our disposition to consider in a comprehensive manner the net impact of such changes, and we're using that to build that into the advice that we provide the minister, so the minister, the government can take their decisions. I should just to clarify, when I was talking about rare, certain examples, certainly not many, where certain studies have been carried out. I wasn't referring specifically to the impact of reducing the lowest rate and non-refundable tax credits. I was just thinking more generally across the range of measures. So just to make that clear.
In this case, what would the timelines look like for if this amendment were to pass? What would the timelines look like in order to produce this type of report ahead of? I assume it would be. I think it's implied here that in the wording that it would be ahead of these income tax measures, or maybe I should just clarify that. It's 10 days after the day on which the report is tabled in both houses of Parliament, right? Is what is included in the wording. So when would the process have to start is what I'm interested in. And how long would it take?
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member. It's a good question. It's hard. It would take some time. We'd want to make sure we provide something that's not only comprehensive but also easily digestible for parliamentarians, because you'd be the ones asking for this information, and basically it's I think what you have before you, if timelines are set out and agreed to by Parliament, those would be timelines that we would we would meet. So, and we would provide we would do our very best to provide the information required in the timeline that you as parliamentarians have set for us.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. And the data that you would use for this report, is there a cost at all to collecting that, or is it already data that you have at your disposal?
Thanks for the question. No particular cost in obtaining the data. The one thing that I would say is that given the timelines in the amendment, we would not be able to use actual tax filer data for the year in which the change comes into force, so 2025, because that won't be available to us for another couple of years. So we would be relying on historical data and estimates.
So would that make it challenging
So
to have?
seeing the clock at 6:30, this meeting is adjourned.
What?